Welcome to Wicked Obsession Tales. If you are a lover of stories that stays with you even after watching, subscribe now so YouTube doesn't hide the next story from you. In the world of Alexander Karsov, silence is the only currency that matters. I've been a ghost in this glass tower for 6 months. That's the secret to surviving a man like Alexander. You learn to move through his life like a draft of cold air, present but never felt. My hands scrub marble floors that reflect light from Italian fixtures I'll never touch without a cleaning rag. I polish crystal carafes filled with spirits that cost more than my grandmother's monthly dialysis, and I dust bookshelves housing first editions that could buy my way out of this city forever. The Karsov penthouse is a fortress of steel and silence, perched so high above Manhattan that the people below look like ants. Alexander himself is a predator I've learned to track by sound. I hear the heavy rhythmic thud of his boots on the glass stairs, and know to vanish into the shadows of the kitchen. I catch glimpses of him through the heavy oak doors of his office, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the city, hair as dark as a winter night, and eyes like shards of gray ice that look right through me as if I'm part of the furniture. He holds court with men who arrive in armored SUVs and leave with blood on their cuffs. I clean up after them. I wipe away the ash of Russian cigarettes, collect heavy tumblers still smelling of expensive rye, and never ever ask why the study smells faintly of copper and ozone. I don't ask questions. That isn't my job. My job is to be the help that isn't heard. The only warmth in my frozen existence is my grandmother. She's 72 with a heart that's tired and kidneys that are failing, living in a one-bedroom in Queens where the radiator hisses but never actually provides heat. Every evening when my shift ends, I take the long bus ride back to her, clutching my bag and counting my tips. I take every overtime hour Alexander's house manager offers because $47,000 in medical debt doesn't pay itself. Because the hospital bills didn't stop when the insurance ran out, they just got meaner. I've signed my name to payment plans that will haunt me until I'm middle-aged, accepted interest rates that feel like a slow-motion robbery, and learned to live on adrenaline and cheap tea. So I scrub. I polish. I disappear. Tuesday night, the rain is drumming a frantic rhythm against the floor-to-ceiling windows. My back is a knot of screaming muscles from deep cleaning the guest wing, and my hands are raw from the bleach. I'm checking my phone, calculating the bus schedule, when I realize the rain has turned into a brutal New York downpour. "You're staying late again, Amira," the housekeeper mutters, tossing me my coat. "The bus is running 20 minutes behind. Be careful." "I'm fine," I say, the lie coming as easily as breathing. "You look like a stiff breeze would knock you over. I just need the hours." I pull my hood up and step out of the service entrance into the biting cold. It's only 4 blocks to the bus stop. 4 blocks through a neighborhood that's supposed to be the safest in the world because it belongs to Alexander Karsov. I've heard the rumors of what happens to people who break the peace on his streets. But tonight, the streets are empty. The streetlights are flickering, casting long, jagged shadows against the wet brick of the alleyways. My sneakers splash through freezing puddles and I keep my head down, counting the seconds until I reach the main road. I'm halfway there when the black sedan rounds the corner, slowing to a crawl beside me. The window rolls down, and the smell of cheap tobacco cuts through the rain. The black sedan didn't look out of place in this neighborhood, but the way it slowed, crawling like a shark in shallow water, made the hair on my arms stand up. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tried to walk faster, my sneakers squeaking against the wet pavement, but the car kept pace. It didn't stop at the curb. It veered toward the mouth of a narrow alleyway just 20 yards ahead of the bus stop, cutting off my path. The doors opened with a series of heavy, metallic thuds that echoed off the brick walls. 3 men stepped out. They weren't wearing the sharp, tailored suits of Alexander's inner circle. These men wore leather jackets that smelled of stale grease and carried an air of desperate, jagged violence. The one in the lead was thick-necked with a jagged scar that cut through his eyebrow, his eyes reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the flickering streetlight. I stopped dead, my breath hitching in my throat. I looked back toward the penthouse towers, toward the safety of the glass fortress I had just left, but the rain obscured everything. I was alone. Is this about the money? I asked, my voice trembling so hard I could barely get the words out. I reached for my bag, fumbling with the zipper. I have $60. Please just take it. The man with the scar laughed, a dry, raspy sound that made me shiver. We don't want your pennies, girl. We know exactly who you work for. We've seen you coming and going from the Karsov Tower for months. My blood turned to ice. Working for Alexander was supposed to be a shield, a silent promise of protection that extended to the very edges of his territory. But as the three men closed the distance, forming a semicircle that backed me into the dark mouth of the alley, I realized the shield had become a target. Karsov thinks he owns these streets, the second man spat, stepping closer. He thinks he can treat this city like his private playground. He's getting comfortable. He's getting soft. I'm just the maid, I whispered, pressing my back against the cold, damp brick. I don't know anything. I don't even talk to him. The leader stepped into my personal space, the heat from his body clashing with the freezing rain. He reached out, his rough fingers catching the collar of my work shirt, pulling the fabric taut until I had to stand on my tiptoes. He stared at the small, embroidered crest on my pocket, the mark of the Karsov household. You're not just a maid, he murmured, his breath smelling of sour coffee and malice. You're one of his things. And Alexander hates it when people touch his things. He shoved me then, not hard enough to knock me down, but enough to send me stumbling back into the shadows of the alley. I tripped over a discarded crate, my hands flying out to catch my fall. My palms scraped against the grit of the pavement, the sting of the raw skin immediate and sharp. Before I could scramble to my feet, a heavy boot slammed down onto my left wrist. I screamed, a raw, jagged sound that was swallowed by the roar of the downpour. The pain was an explosion, a white-hot flash that blinded me for a second. I could feel the delicate bones in my hand grinding against the unforgiving concrete. Let's see how well you scrub his floors now, the leader hissed. He shifted his weight, grinding his heel into the center of my palm. I heard the sickening pop of a joint giving way, a sound that felt louder than the thunder rolling overhead. I tried to pull my arm away, but the other two men pinned my shoulders to the ground, their grip like iron manacles. This is a message, the man said, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. Tell the great King Karsov that the Volkovs are tired of sharing. Tell him that if he can't even protect the girl who pours his coffee, he can't protect this city. He withdrew his boot, and for a heartbeat, the pressure vanished, replaced by a throbbing, agonizing heat that felt like my arm was on fire. I curled into a ball, cradling my mangled hand against my chest, my tears mixing with the rain on my face. They didn't check my pockets. They didn't take my phone. They simply climbed back into the sedan and sped away, leaving the scent of burning rubber and the sound of my own ragged sobbing in their wake. I lay there for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones until I couldn't tell if I was shaking from the temperature or the trauma. My grandmother was waiting. The dialysis bill was due. And as I looked down at my hand, swollen, distorted, and useless, I knew the invisibility that had kept me safe for 6 months was gone. The monster in the penthouse was going to see me now. And God help us all when he did. The morning arrived with a cruel gray light that seemed to pulse in time with the throbbing in my arm. I woke up on the small sofa in my grandmother's apartment, still wearing my damp clothes from the night before, my body stiff with a cold that felt like it had settled in my marrow. For a few seconds the world was quiet, and then I tried to move my left hand. A jagged bolt of white-hot agony shot up my radius, pinning me back against the cushions. I gasped, a soft, broken sound, as I stared at the damage in the dim morning light. My wrist was no longer mine. It was a distorted landscape of deep purples and sickly greens, swollen to twice its normal size. My cheek felt heavy and tight. The skin stretched over a hematoma that made it hard to fully open my left eye. I couldn't afford a doctor. I couldn't even afford the bus fare to an emergency room where I'd wait 10 hours just to be told what I already knew. Something was broken. More importantly, I couldn't afford to be absent. In Alexander's world, you were either useful or you were gone. I dragged myself to the bathroom, my movements slow and mechanical. With my good hand, I fumbled through the medicine cabinet until I found a half-empty bottle of expired ibuprofen. I swallowed 4 without water, the chalky pills scratching my dry throat. Next came the camouflage. I spent 30 minutes in front of the cracked mirror, applying layer after layer of heavy, theatrical concealer I'd bought for a theater elective in high school. I dabbed it over my cheek and the corner of my eye until the black and blue faded into an unnatural flat beige. Then came the hardest part. I found an old ace bandage in the back of the linen closet. Using my teeth and my right hand, I began to bind my left wrist. Every wrap was a fresh descent into hell. I pulled the elastic tight, trying to compress the swelling, trying to force the bones into some semblance of alignment, so I could hide the deformity under my long-sleeved work shirt. By the time I was finished, beads of sweat were rolling down my forehead and I was lightheaded from the pain. I looked at my reflection. I looked tired, brittle, and ghostly, but I looked functional. That was all that mattered. The commute to the penthouse was a blur of nausea. Every bump the bus hit sent a fresh wave of fire through my arm. I kept my left hand shoved deep into my coat pocket, cradling it like a wounded animal. When I finally reached the service entrance of the Karsov Tower, I took a deep breath of the sterilized, expensive air and pushed inside. The morning routine was a gauntlet of silent torture. I started in the secondary kitchen, tasking myself with the light dusting, hoping I could hide my useless limb. But the house manager, a stern woman who valued efficiency above all else, pointed toward the grand foyer. "The marble needs a deep polish, Amira. The Pakhan has guests arriving at noon." I nodded, not trusting my voice. I filled the silver bucket with warm water and lemon-scented solvent. Each drop of water added to the weight, making the handle feel like a lead bar. I dragged it to the center of the foyer, the sound of the plastic bottom scraping against the stone echoing like a gunshot in the quiet house. I knelt on the cold floor, my knees aching. I dipped the microfiber cloth into the water and then reached in to wring it out. It was a movement I had done 1,000 times, a mindless secondary action. But as I gripped the cloth and attempted to twist, my left wrist simply gave out. The pain wasn't just a physical sensation. It was an emotional collapse. It was the sound of a dialysis machine stopping because the bill wasn't paid. It was the sound of an eviction notice being taped to a door. I tried again, my teeth gritted so hard I thought they might shatter, my eyes blurring with involuntary tears. I forced my left hand to close, to turn, to twist. A sharp, sickening pop echoed in my ears, and a fresh wave of agony caused my stomach to flip. I dropped the cloth back into the bucket with a splash, my breath coming in short, ragged hitches. I leaned my forehead against the cool marble, waiting for the world to stop spinning. I was damaged goods. I was a broken tool in a house that only kept the finest things. If Alexander saw me like this, limping through my chores, unable to even squeeze a rag, he wouldn't see a woman in need of help. He would see a flaw in his perfect, ordered world. He would see a ghost that had finally become too heavy to haunt the halls. I forced myself to stand, my vision tunneling. I had to finish. I had to be invisible again. I reached for the bucket, my fingers trembling, unaware that the shadow at the top of the stairs had already stopped moving. Alexander was watching, and the silence of the penthouse had never felt more like a predatory trap. The morning sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, but it didn't bring any warmth to the air. The temperature in Alexander's private office was kept at a steady, shivering cold, much like the man himself. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the silver tray and the tiny porcelain cup of espresso I had just prepared. The aroma of the dark, expensive beans usually felt comforting, but today it made my stomach churn. My left hand was tucked against my waist, hidden by the folds of my oversized work shirt, but I could feel the pulse of my heartbeat drumming against the ace bandage like a trapped bird. Every time I moved, the pain flared, a jagged reminder of the alleyway and the heavy boot that had crushed my livelihood. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I only had to do this once. Walk in, set the tray down, and walk out. I used my right hand to lift the tray, balancing it with a practiced ease I didn't truly feel. My left hand was supposed to be the anchor, the stabilizer, but today it was a liability. I stepped toward the heavy mahogany doors of the study, my sneakers silent on the plush carpet. The doors were slightly ajar. I pushed through them, the scent of old leather and cold ozone hitting me instantly. Alexander was sitting behind his desk, his silhouette framed by the sprawling skyline of Manhattan. He didn't look up. He never looked up. He was focused on a stack of documents, a gold fountain pen moving across the paper with lethal precision. I approached the desk, my eyes fixed on the silver tray to keep them from wandering toward him. I could feel the cold radiating off the glass walls, making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I reached the edge of the desk and began to lower the tray. That was when the tremor started. It wasn't a slow build. It was a sudden violent spasm that originated deep in my wrist and traveled up my forearm like an electric shock. My fingers, bound tight under the bandage, betrayed me. They cramped, locked in a position of agony, and the tray tilted. I tried to catch it. I lunged with my right hand, but I was too slow. The porcelain cup slid across the silver surface and hit the corner of the mahogany desk. It shattered with a sound that seemed to roar in the quiet room. Dark espresso splashing across the white documents and the polished wood. Shards of porcelain skittered across the floor like tiny jagged teeth. I froze. The world stopped. The scratching of the fountain pen ceased. Silence, heavy and suffocating, filled the space between us. I stood there, my left arm now dangling at my side, the sleeve of my shirt pushed up just enough to reveal the edge of the dirty beige bandage. My heart was thumping so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. In the world of the Bratva, mistakes weren't just errors. They were signs of weakness, and weakness was an invitation for replacement. I stared at the dark stain spreading across his desk, my mind racing through the consequences. I couldn't afford to be fired. I couldn't afford to lose the only thing keeping my grandmother alive. Alexander moved. It wasn't the fast, explosive movement of a man in a rage. It was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. He set the gold pen down and pushed his chair back. The leather creaked under his weight. Then he stood up. He towered over me, a wall of dark wool and absolute authority. His shadow fell across me, blotting out the morning light. I squeezed my eyes shut, my shoulders hunching instinctively. I expected the back of a hand. I expected to be grabbed by the collar and thrown toward the door. I braced myself for the impact of his anger, the kind of violence I had seen him dispense to men twice my size. But the strike never came. Instead, the air in the room seemed to grow even colder. A heavy, pressurized stillness that made it hard to breathe. "Amira," he said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. It was the first time he had ever spoken my name, and the sound of it made me tremble more than the pain did. I opened my eyes, looking up at him through the blur of involuntary tears. He wasn't looking at the shattered porcelain. He wasn't looking at the ruined documents. His eyes, those shards of gray ice, were fixed entirely on my left arm. He reached out, his large hand hovering just inches from my sleeve. "Look at me," he commanded. I looked, and for the first time in 6 months the Pakhan wasn't looking through me. He was looking at me. And in the depths of that icy stare, I saw something far more dangerous than anger. I saw recognition. The ghost had finally been seen, and there was nowhere left to hide. I didn't move. I couldn't. The spilled espresso was a dark, steaming lake on his desk, but Alexander didn't spare it a second glance. His entire focus remained anchored on me, his presence so massive and suffocating that the air in the room seemed to vanish. I stayed hunched, my eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the storm to break. Instead, I felt his hand. It wasn't the violent grab I had prepared for. His fingers were large and calloused, but they wrapped around my forearm with a precision that was almost terrifyingly gentle. I flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk that sent a spike of white-hot pain through my wrist, and a soft broken whimper escaped my lips before I could bite it back. Alexander's grip didn't tighten, but it didn't release me either. He held me steady, his thumb resting just above the edge of the dirty beige bandage I'd hidden under my sleeve. I could feel the heat of his skin through the fabric, a stark contrast to the icy chill of the room. "Show me your hands," he growled. The command was low, vibrating with a tonal shift that made my knees weak. It wasn't just an order, it was an interrogation. I tried to pull back, my heart hammering against my ribs like a panicked bird. "It's nothing, Mr. Karsov. I'm just clumsy. I'll clean it up. I'll pay for the porcelain, I promise." "Amira." He didn't raise his voice, but the way he spoke my name cut through my frantic rambling like a blade. He stepped closer, forcing me to straighten my back or be swallowed by his shadow. With agonizing slowness, he began to roll back the sleeve of my work shirt. I held my breath as the ace bandage was revealed. It was stained with sweat and a little grime from the morning's cleaning, looking cheap and pathetic against the backdrop of his $1 million office. Alexander's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He didn't ask for permission. He found the end of the wrap and began to unwind it. Every turn of the fabric felt like a layer of my skin was being peeled away. As the last layer fell, the true extent of the damage was laid bare. My wrist was a grotesque mosaic of deep violet and sickly yellow, the skin stretched tight over the swelling. Even in the dim light, the distinct jagged indentation of a boot heel was visible in the center of my palm. Alexander's hand stilled. For a long moment, he just looked at the wreckage of my hand, his thumb hovering over the bruised flesh but never touching it, as if he were afraid he might break what was already shattered. The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of a cold office. It was the silence that precedes a landslide. "Who did this?" he asked. The words were barely a whisper, yet they carried a weight that made the floor feel unstable beneath my feet. "It was just an accident in the street," I lied, my voice cracking. "A mugging. They wanted my bag." Alexander finally looked up from my hand. His eyes weren't just ice anymore. They were a frozen wasteland, devoid of anything but a dark, predatory intent. He looked at the bruised cheek I'd tried so hard to cover with concealer, his gaze stripping away the makeup until I felt naked. "Liar," he said, and the word was a promise of violence. "A mugger takes the bag and runs. This is a message. They broke your bones to see if I would notice." He released my arm, but the loss of his touch felt colder than the pain. He turned away from me, walking toward the window that overlooked the city he ruled. He stood there for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette a sharp, dark blade against the Manhattan skyline. When he spoke again, his voice was different. The growl was gone, replaced by a flat, emotionless tone that was infinitely more terrifying. It was the sound of a man who had already decided who was going to die. "You are a ghost in this house, Amira. You move through these halls thinking you are invisible." He turned back to face me, and for the first time I saw the true face of the Bratva King. The icy detachment had shattered, replaced by an instant, cold rage that felt like a physical force in the room. "They touched what belongs under my roof," he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine with lethal intensity. "They think they can reach into my world and break the things I've chosen to keep. By sunrise, they will realize their mistake. And you will never hide your pain from me again." He didn't look at the ruined papers or the coffee on his desk. He looked at me, and I realized then that my invisibility hadn't been a shield at all. It had been a countdown. And now the time had run out. The transition from the office to the master suite felt like a fever dream. Alexander didn't call for a maid or the house manager to escort me. He guided me himself, his hand hovering at the small of my back, a silent, heavy presence that made the hallway feel miles long. I tried to protest, to tell him I had floors to scrub and a bus to catch, but one look at his profile set in a mask of granite stifled the words in my throat. He pushed open the double doors to his bedroom, a space I had only ever seen from the threshold, with a vacuum and a heavy heart. It was a cavern of charcoal silks and dark wood, smelling of sandalwood and the same ozone that clung to him. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the velvet chaise lounge near the window. "I'm not allowed in here like this," I whispered, clutching my throbbing arm. "I'll get the upholstery dirty. I have to go home, Alexander." "My grandmother." "You are going nowhere," he interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating floorboard's deep rumble. "You will not step foot outside this tower until I say the city is safe for you." "But I'll lose my job," I cried, the desperation finally breaking through. "I can't lose the hours. I have bills, I told you, Amira. You are no longer a ghost." He turned his back to me and pulled a sleek, encrypted phone from his pocket. I watched, breathless, as the Pakhan disappeared and the warlord took his place. He didn't speak in the measured tones he used with me. He spoke in rapid-fire Russian, his voice a series of sharp rhythmic strikes. I didn't need to know the language to understand the intent. He was calling his vor. He was summoning his captains. Within minutes, the distant hum of the penthouse changed. I heard the muffled thud of heavy boots on the stairs, the distinctive click of electronic locks engaging, and the low, urgent murmur of men in the foyer. The penthouse was no longer a home. It was a fortress. The air felt pressurized, thick with the sudden arrival of soldiers. This wasn't protection, it was a declaration of war. Alexander vanished into his private kitchen, and returned a moment later carrying a silver bowl of crushed ice and a silk cloth. He didn't hand it to me. He pulled a small stool in front of the chaise and sat, his large frame dwarfing the furniture. "Give me your hand," he said. I hesitated, then slowly extended my left arm. The swelling had worsened, the skin now a shiny, angry red. He took my wrist in his palm, his skin so warm it felt like a brand. He began to wrap the ice in the silk, his movements methodical and surprisingly focused. When he pressed the cold pack against my palm, I hissed, my body jerking in a reflex of pure pain. "Quiet little bird," he murmured. He didn't pull away. Instead, he shifted his grip, sliding his large, calloused hand over mine to hold the ice in place. His thumb began to stroke the unbruised skin of my forearm in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. It was the first time I had felt his touch without the barrier of a sleeve or the distraction of fear. It was intimate in a way that terrified me more than the Volkovs ever could. The Pakhan of the New York Bratva was sitting at my feet, tending to my wounds as if I were the most fragile porcelain in his collection. I looked at the gold chain catching the light at his throat, then up at his face. He wasn't looking at my hand anymore. He was looking at me, his gray eyes searching mine with an intensity that felt like he was reading my very soul. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. "I'm just the girl who cleans your glass." Alexander's thumb stopped its movement, pressing firmly against my pulse point. He leaned in, the scent of him surrounding me, a mixture of danger and something that felt dangerously like home. "Because they thought you were nothing," he whispered. "And they were wrong. You are the only thing in this city I didn't have to buy. And I do not let anyone break what belongs to me." Outside, the rain turned to sleet, rattling against the reinforced glass like 1,000 tiny bullets. But inside the master suite, for the first time in 8 months, the cold didn't reach me. I was a prisoner in a golden cage, guarded by a monster. And as he adjusted the ice with a tenderness that defied everything I knew about him, I realized I didn't want to run. The sanctuary of the master bedroom was short-lived. Once the ice had numbed the worst of the fire in my wrist, Alexander stood, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the charcoal silk of the bedsheets. He didn't offer a gentle parting. He simply looked at me, his eyes two flinty sparks of resolve, and told me to stay. Then he vanished into the bowels of the penthouse, leaving the scent of sandalwood and impending storm in his wake. I couldn't stay still. The silence of the room was heavy, vibrating with the unseen machinery of a war being spun into motion. Driven by a mix of fear and a strange magnetic pull toward the center of the chaos, I slipped out of the bedroom. The hallways were no longer empty. Men in dark tactical gear stood at every junction, their faces masks of professional indifference. They didn't stop me. It was as if the word had already been passed. The ghost was now a guest. I found Alexander in the security hub, a room buried deep in the core of the penthouse. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the home. No marble, no gold, just the cold blue glow of 20 different monitors flickering with feeds from every corner of his territory. Alexander stood in the center, his hands braced on a steel console, his back a broad, unyielding wall of tension. On the largest screen, the grain of a street-level security camera played out in stuttering motion. I felt my breath hitch. It was the alleyway. The rain looked like silver needles on the black and white feed. I saw myself, a small hooded figure struggling against the downpour. Then the black sedan drifted into the frame like a predator. Alexander didn't turn when I entered, but I saw his shoulders tighten. He was watching the three men step out. He watched the moment I was shoved into the shadows. When the leader's boot came down on my wrist, the sound of Alexander's teeth grinding together was audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "Identify them," Alexander said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. One of his captains, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, tapped a key. Facial recognition boxes pulsed red before turning green. Volkov's primary enforcers, Pakhan. The one in the lead is Grigory. They've been seen near the shipping docks. The captain hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Alexander. "Should I put out the execution order? One of our snipers is already in position." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alexander leaned closer to the screen, his eyes fixed on the image of the man who had crushed my hand. For a heartbeat, I expected him to nod, to give the word that would end their lives with a single silent click of a trigger. "No," Alexander whispered, and the word felt heavier than a death sentence. "Cancel the kill order." The captain blinked, confused. "Pakhan, bring them to me," Alexander commanded, finally turning away from the screen. His face was a mask of cold, focused fury, the kind of expression that made even his own men take a step back. "I want them alive. I want them to feel the weight of what they've done. They didn't just break a girl's hand. They challenged the throne." He caught sight of me standing in the doorway, my injured arm cradled against my chest. He didn't scold me for leaving the room. Instead, he walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped just inches away, the heat of his anger radiating off him like a furnace. "They thought they could hide in the dark, Amira," he said, his voice for my ears only. "They thought the rain would wash away their footprints. But there is no corner of this city I cannot reach." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, his touch a jarring contrast to the violent orders he had just given. "By the time the sun touches this floor tomorrow, they will be on their knees in front of you. And they will learn that the things I protect are the things no man is allowed to survive touching." He turned back to his captain, his voice snapping like a whip. "Get the cars ready. I'm going with you." I watched him walk out, a king going to claim his tithe in blood. I was no longer a ghost, but I was beginning to realize that being seen by Alexander Karsov meant being the center of a world that was about to burn. I retreated back toward the master suite, the blue glow of the monitors etched into my mind, knowing that the night was only just beginning. The hours of the deep night crawled by in a blur of morphine-induced sleep and the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. When I finally woke, the world was a ghostly, bruised purple. It was that liminal hour just before dawn, where the sky is heavy with the weight of the coming day. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the autumn rain had finally surrendered to a biting sleet, and thin, wet flakes of snow were beginning to swirl against the glass like tiny, frantic ghosts. The door to the master suite opened with a soft, authoritative click. Alexander stood there, still in his dark suit, though his tie was gone and the gold chain at his throat caught the dim light. He looked tired, but it was a lethal kind of exhaustion, the weariness of a predator who had finally finished the hunt. "It is time," he said. He didn't wait for me to agree. He walked over and helped me into a thick cashmere coat that smelled of his cologne, carefully guiding my splinted arm through the sleeve. He led me toward the terrace, his hand firm on my shoulder, a silent anchor in the sea of my trembling. As we stepped out onto the wide, glass-walled terrace, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind whipped the falling snow into a frenzy, and the lights of Manhattan below looked like a drowned city beneath the gray mist. In the center of the terrace, 3 men were kneeling on the wet stone. They were bound, their heads covered in dark hoods, their bodies shivering violently in the freezing air. Alexander stepped forward, his boots crunching on the thin layer of slush. He reached down and yanked the hoods off one by one. I recoiled, my heart stopping. It was them. The man with the scarred eyebrow, Grigory, and the 2 others who had pinned me to the grit of the alleyway. They didn't look like monsters anymore. They looked small. They looked terrified. Grigory's eyes widened as they landed on me, then darted to Alexander. "Please, Karsov," he croaked, his voice cracking with the cold. We didn't know. We didn't know she was yours." Alexander didn't answer him. He turned back to me, his hand catching my chin, forcing me to look away from the skyline and directly at the men who had broken me. "Look at them, Amira," he commanded. His voice was low, vibrating with a terrifying quiet power. I tried to turn away, but he held me steady. The snow was beginning to settle in his dark hair, and his eyes were the same gray as the morning sky. "I want you to see them," he whispered, his thumb brushing over my bruised cheek. "I want you to see what happens to men who think they can touch a ghost and live. Watch them, Amira. Watch them fear you." He was right. Grigory wasn't looking at Alexander with the defiance of a rival. He was looking at me with the absolute, soul-deep terror of a man facing his executioner. For months I had been the one afraid. I had been the one hiding in the shadows, hoping to remain unnoticed. But as I stood there in Alexander's coat, surrounded by his men, the power dynamic of the city seemed to tilt on its axis. Alexander reached into the small of his back and pulled a heavy matte black handgun from his holster. The sound of the slide racking back was a sharp final crack that echoed across the terrace. "No," I whispered, the word lost to the wind. "This is the only language they understand," Alexander said, his voice as cold as the ice on the stone. He stepped toward Grigory. The man began to sob, a pathetic, wet sound that made my stomach turn. Alexander didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a speech or a chance for penance. He raised the weapon. A single shot rang out, muffled by the heavy, damp air and the roar of the wind. Grigory slumped forward into the snow, the white slush turning a sudden violent crimson. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath hitching in my chest, but I didn't move. 2 more shots followed in quick succession, rhythmic and cold. When I finally opened my eyes, the terrace was silent again. The 3 men were gone, their bodies already being moved by Alexander's silent, efficient soldiers. The blood on the stone was being washed away by the sleet, diluted until it was nothing more than a faint pink stain. Alexander stood at the edge of the terrace, his weapon lowered, looking out as the first sliver of the sun broke over the horizon. The light was a pale, sickly gold, cutting through the gray clouds and painting the snowy terrace in a wash of rose and shadow. He turned to me, the monster finally at rest. "The message is sent," he said. He walked back to me and took my good hand in his, pulling me toward the warmth of the penthouse. The city was waking up below us, millions of people starting their days, unaware that the world had changed in the dark. I looked back one last time at the spot where I had been avenged, and I realized that the girl who had walked home in the rain was dead. The sunrise didn't just bring a new day. It brought a new life. One where I was no longer invisible, but where every light in the city now burned because the man beside me allowed it. The transition from the freezing terrace to the warmth of the master suite felt like crossing between 2 different worlds. My mind was still out there, caught in the sound of the shots and the sight of the snow turning crimson, leaving me hollow and numb. I stood in the center of the bedroom, my cashmere coat still heavy on my shoulders, while the silence of the penthouse pressed against my ears like deep water. I was shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in my knees and worked its way up to my jaw. Alexander didn't leave me to fall apart alone. He guided me into the master bathroom, a space of white marble and heated stone that felt far too bright for the darkness still clinging to my soul. He closed the door, sealing us in a world of steam and expensive soap, away from the men who were cleaning the terrace and the city that was beginning to stir outside. He stepped toward the vanity and turned on the gold-plated faucets. The sound of running water filled the room, a domestic, ordinary sound that felt jarring after the violence of the morning. Alexander reached out, his hands stained with the soot of the weapon and the faint, dark spray of the terrace. He held them under the stream, scrubbing with a mechanical, cold precision until the water ran clear. I watched him in the mirror, my vision tunneling. I was in shock, the reality of what I had seen finally catching up to my heart. My left hand, the one he had avenged, felt heavy and strange in its splint, a physical anchor to a night that shouldn't have been real. Amira, he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. He didn't wait for me to move. He took a plush, white washcloth and soaked it in the warm water. Then he turned to me. I expected him to tell me to clean myself, to point toward the shower and regain his distance. Instead, he stepped into my space, his large frame blocking out the rest of the room. He reached out and gently tilted my head back. His fingers were warm now, the heat of the water still radiating from his skin. I squeezed my eyes shut as he pressed the damp cloth against my cheek, the one covered in the makeup I'd used to hide my shame. He moved with agonizing slowness, wiping away the layers of beige concealer, the dried salt of my tears, and the flecks of sleet that had frozen to my skin. He washed my face as if he were cleaning a sacred icon, his touch reverent and absolute. Every stroke of the cloth felt like it was stripping away the last 8 months of invisibility, peeling back the maid and the ghost until only the woman remained. "Open your eyes," he whispered. I did, looking up at him through the steam. He had finished cleaning my skin, and for the first time he looked satisfied. He reached up to his own neck, his fingers deft as he unhooked the heavy gold chain he always wore. It was a thick, solid piece of craftsmanship, a symbol of the pecan's status that I had watched catch the light 1,000 times from the shadows. He didn't say a word as he stepped closer, the heat of his body surrounding me. He draped the chain around my neck. The gold was warm from his skin, its weight unexpected and grounding. It hung low against my work shirt, a brilliant, shining brand against the fabric of a servant. "This is not a trinket, Amira," he said, his voice a low, possessive growl. "This is my name. This is my protection." He held the links between his thumb and forefinger, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room feel small. In the world of the Bratva, a woman wearing the pecan's gold wasn't just a guest. She was a declaration. It was a warning to every man in the city that to look at me was to look at him, and to touch me was to invite the sunrise I had just witnessed on the terrace. "You will never have to hide your face again," he continued, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw where the bruise was now bare. "You do not belong to the shadows. You belong to me." I looked at our reflection in the mirror, the tall, lethal king of the underworld and the girl who had once been heir. The chain was heavy, a golden shackle that offered the only true freedom I had ever known. I reached up with my good hand, my fingers curling around the warm metal, and for the first time since the alleyway, the shaking stopped. The ghost was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. A woman who had been found. The pale gold of the morning sun finally spilled over the jagged edges of the Manhattan skyline, turning the glass and steel of the city into a sea of liquid amber. On the penthouse balcony, the air was crisp, tasting of the lingering snow and the promise of a quiet day. A table had been set with silver cloches and white linen, the steam from a fresh pot of tea curling into the cold air. I sat at the edge of the wrought iron chair, the heavy gold chain still warm against my throat, its weight a constant reminder that the world had fundamentally shifted. I looked down at my splinted hand, then at the sprawling city below. For 8 months those streets had been a maze I navigated with my head down. A place where I was just another shadow struggling to stay ahead of the bills. Now from this height the city looked small. It looked manageable. Alexander sat opposite me, his dark suit exchanged for a silk shirt that he wore with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the powerful cords of his forearms. He was reading a briefing, his eyes scanning the pages with that same lethal focus I had seen on the terrace, but his posture was relaxed, the sharp edges of his tension softened by the morning light. Habit is a difficult thing to break. When the timer on the tea steeped, I instinctively moved to stand. My fingers reached for the silver handle, my mind already calculating the steps to serve him, to be useful, to earn my place in the only way I knew how. "Sit," he said, his voice a low vibration that didn't even look up from his papers. "I'm just getting the tea, Mr. Karsov," I whispered, my good hand hovering over the pot. "I can still manage. I don't want to be a burden." I started to rise, my legs shaky, but before I could fully stand, Alexander's hand shot out. He didn't grab me with the coldness of a master. He caught my waist with a firm, possessive strength and pulled. I gasped as I was guided not back into my chair, but directly into his lap. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I was suddenly surrounded by him, the scent of sandalwood, the heat of his skin, and the terrifyingly solid presence of the man who had burned the night for me. I tried to shift, my heart hammering against the gold chain. "Alexander, I shouldn't." "Look at me, Amira," he commanded, his hand moving to rest on the small of my back, anchoring me to him. I looked, and the ice in his gray eyes had finally melted into something dark and molten. He reached out and took my splinted hand, lifting it with a tenderness that made my eyes sting. He kissed the tips of my fingers, his stubble grazing my skin. "The debt is gone," he said, the words falling like heavy, golden coins in the quiet morning. "I've bought the notes from the hospital. The interest, the principal, all of it has been erased. Your grandmother has been moved to a private clinic in Westchester. She has the best doctors in the country, and she will never see another bill as long as she lives." The air left my lungs in a long, shaky exhale. The weight I had carried for 2 years, the crushing, suffocating mountain of $47,000, was simply gone. I felt light, almost dizzy, as the reality of it settled into my bones. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because you are no longer the girl who cleans my glass," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip. "You will never touch a cleaning rag again. You will never move through a room hoping to be unnoticed." He turned my chin so I was forced to look out at the city. The sun was fully up now, reflecting off the windows of 1,000 buildings, each one a tiny part of the empire he ruled. "Do you see it?" he asked. "For everyone else, those streets are a struggle. But for you, they are a kingdom. You aren't a ghost in this city anymore, Amira. You are the reason I keep it standing." I leaned back against his chest, the gold chain clinking softly against his shirt. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the future. I wasn't counting pennies or hiding bruises. I was seen. I was protected. And as the warmth of the sun hit the balcony, I realized that the man who had taught the city to fear the sunrise had given me the only thing I ever truly wanted: a home where I didn't have to disappear. The city below belonged to Alexander Karsov, but as he tightened his hold on me, I knew that Alexander Karsov belonged to me.